Emma by Jane Austen. Part 1. The Mistress of Hartfield House. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition, seemed to have a perfect life. She was 21 years old, with very few problems. Emma had one sister, Isabella, who lived in London with her husband, Mr. John Knightley, and her children. Emma's mother had died while she was still very young. Since then, Miss Taylor had been Emma's governess and friend for 16 years. They were very fond of each other. But now Miss Taylor was getting married to Mr. Weston and would move to his house, called Randalls. Emma lived at Hartfield, a mansion on the edge of the village of Highbury. It was 16 miles from London. The Woodhouse family was the most important family in the village. Another important family, the Knightleys, lived at Donwell Abbey, a few miles away. John Knightley's brother, Mr. George Knightley, lived there. He was 37 years old, unmarried, and very popular in the neighbourhood. There were only two evils in Emma's life. Firstly, she had been spoilt by her father and Miss Taylor ever since her mother's death. Secondly, she had a very high opinion of herself. In fact, Emma thought that she was perfect. It was Miss Taylor's wedding day. Emma was very sad because her best friend had left the house. Mr. Weston, her new husband, was an excellent man. His first wife had died. His son had been adopted by his wife's family in the north of England, the Churchills, and he had lived alone for many years. Everyone liked him. But without Miss Taylor, Emma would have no young companion in the house. She loved her father, Mr. Woodhouse, but he was always worried about illness or other dangers.
"Oh, poor Miss Taylor,"
said Mr. Woodhouse at every meal while he was eating his gruel.
"I wish she were here. What a pity that she married Mr. Weston."
"I cannot agree with you, Papa,"
said Emma.
"Miss Taylor will be far happier with her own home. We shall often visit them. We shall go in the carriage."
"Oh, the poor horses! The poor driver!"
"Don't worry. Everything is perfect."
"Poor Miss Taylor!"
said Mr. Woodhouse again. At that moment, Mr. Knightley of Donwell Abbey came into the room.
"I have been to London,"
he said,
"to visit my brother's family."
"Oh, poor Isabella,"
said Mr. Woodhouse.
"London is a very unhealthy place for her to live."
"She and the children are all very well. Did the wedding go well?"
"Ah, poor Miss Taylor. It is a sad business."
"Nonsense,"
said Mr. Knightley.
"It is better to be independent."
"Tell the truth, Mr. Knightley,"
said Emma playfully.
"You think it is better for Miss Taylor to escape from me and my silly imagination."
"No, dear Emma. Perhaps I never flatter you, but I admire you greatly."
"Don't forget,"
said Emma,
"that I myself made the match between Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston. Everybody said that Mr. Weston would never get married again, but I was right."
"Oh, dear Emma, please don't make any more marriages,"
said her father sadly.
"I will not get married myself, Papa, but I am really successful in making matches for other people. I planned the marriage of Miss Taylor, and now, dear Papa, I shall plan for others."
"Nonsense,"
said Mr. Knightley.
"Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston decided themselves to get married. You did nothing. You just made a lucky guess."
"I encouraged Mr. Weston to visit Hartfield and meet Miss Taylor. I played an important part."
"It is a dangerous thing to do, Emma. Don't interfere in other people's lives."
"Dear Emma is so kind. She always thinks about others,"
said Mr. Woodhouse affectionately.
"Mr. Elton, the vicar, needs a wife. I will look for one for him,"
declared Emma. Mr. Knightley laughed.
He is 27 years old. He can find his own wife if he wants one. Oh, Emma, be serious.
Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Mr. Knightley and Mr. Elton, the vicar, often came to visit Mr. Woodhouse. They also came, of course, to talk with his lovely daughter. There was another group of visitors. Mrs. Bates was a very old lady. Her daughter, Miss Bates, was middle-aged, but single. She devoted her life to caring for her mother. Miss Bates was famous for talking too much and saying stupid things. But she was so kind and generous that nobody disliked her. Mrs. Goddard, their friend, was the headmistress of the village school. One evening they brought Harriet Smith, an orphan, with them to meet Emma and Mr. Woodhouse. Harriet was a very pretty girl, about 18. She was short, plump, and fair with blue eyes. Nobody knew who her parents had been. She lived at the school. Emma immediately liked Harriet Smith. She was sweet, shy, and very grateful for the invitation to Hartfield.
I can help this girl,
thought Emma.
I can give her knowledge and good manners. She isn't clever, but she has soft eyes and a beautiful appearance.
Emma invited Harriet more and more to Hartfield. She enjoyed helping and influencing her. Little by little, Harriet shyly told her about herself.
Last summer, I stayed with the Martins at Abbey Mill Farm on Mr. Knightley's estate. They were very kind to me. They have 8 cows on their farm.
Emma, the mistress of Hartfield House, was not interested in cows. But when she found out that Harriet had met Mr. Martin, the unmarried son of the family, she became worried.
He came with us on our moonlit walks. Once he rode 3 miles to get me some walnuts. He's very clever and has a fine flock of sheep. His mother says that he will make a fine husband.
Emma did not like this story. She wanted to improve Harriet. Emma did not want her to be in love with an uneducated farmer.
What does Mr. Martin look like?
Asked Emma.
He's not handsome, but I like him. Haven't you seen him? He often rides through Highbury.
I don't notice young farmers,
said Emma snobbishly.
How old is he?
24.
Ah, he is much too young to get married. He must wait at least 6 years until he has enough money.
6 years, Miss Woodhouse,
exclaimed Harriet.
But he'll be 30.
Next day they met Mr. Martin when they were out walking. He looked very happy to see Harriet. Emma thought that he was neat and looked sensible, but he was not handsome. When he had gone, Harriet came running back to Emma with a smiling face.
It was so lucky to meet him. What do you think of him, Miss Woodhouse?
He is very plain, remarkably plain, and he is clearly not a gentleman. He has no manners.
Harriet was very disappointed.
Of course,
she said sadly.
He's not as genteel as a real gentleman.
I think, Harriet, since you have known me, you have been in the company of real gentlemen. I should be surprised if you can still like Mr. Martin.
Certainly, he is not like Mr. Knightley, but Mr. Knightley is a very fine man.
True, Mr. Knightley is 1 in 100, and Mr. Elton is also an example of a very fine gentleman. In fact, I think that Mr. Elton likes you, Harriet.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do you think so?
And Harriet seemed to have completely forgotten Mr. Martin, the young farmer. Emma congratulated herself. She was the perfect matchmaker. Meanwhile, Mr. Knightley was talking to Mrs. Weston about Emma.
I think this friendship between Emma and Harriet Smith is a bad thing, Mrs. Weston.
A bad thing? Why? I am very pleased to see them together,
replied Mrs. Weston.
To educate Harriet, Emma will read more herself.
Emma always plans to read more. I have seen all the lists of books she made when she was 12 years old. But she is never hard-working or patient. Her imagination is stronger than her understanding. Her father spoils her. And since her mother died, she has been the mistress of Hartfield and the mistress of you all.
But she is so happy to have a friend of her own age. She looks very well.
Yes, Emma is very pretty.
Pretty, Mr. Knightley? She is perfect beauty,
said Mrs. Weston.
Well, I confess that I have seldom seen anyone more attractive. But I am an old friend. She always says that she will never marry. It would do her good to be in love, but there is no one in Highbury to attract her.
Mrs. Weston smiled mysteriously. Would Emma fall in love with Frank Churchill, Mr. Weston's son, if he came to Highbury? It would be the perfect marriage. Part 2. Matchmaker or Troublemaker? Emma had decided to make a match between Mr. Elton and Harriet Smith. Emma was sure that Mr. Elton was already half in love with her.
You have given Harriet so much,
he told her.
You have made her graceful and elegant, Miss Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Elton.
Let me ask you to paint her picture, Miss Woodhouse. You're a talented artist.
Harriet was very shy, but she agreed to sit for her portrait. Emma took out her watercolours and began to work. Mr. Elton sat near her, constantly jumping up to look at the picture.
That is an excellent likeness.
Thank you, Mr. Elton,
said Emma.
He must be very much in love with her. I have only just begun,
she thought.
Harriet is not as beautiful as that,
said Mr. Weston, arriving to see Mr. Woodhouse.
You have made her too tall,
said Mr. Knightley.
Poor Harriet,
said Mr. Woodhouse.
You are painting her outdoors. She will catch cold. Oh, no,
said Mr. Elton.
It is a perfect work of art. I will ride to London to have it framed.
Emma was very pleased. Mr. Elton was obviously in love. But next day, Harriet came to Hartfield soon after breakfast.
What is the matter?
asked Emma.
Mr. Martin has written to me. He has asked me to marry him.
He wants to have good connections,
said Emma coldly.
Please read the letter. It is a very good letter.
Emma was surprised to find that the letter was short but well written.
But what shall I do?
asked Harriet.
You ought to write politely but firmly like a lady. Thank him for his offer, but explain that it is impossible.
I had no idea that he liked me so much. Do you think that it is better to say no, Miss Woodhouse?
You must make your own decision.
Then perhaps I ought to refuse him.
Perfectly right, Harriet. If you were married to a farmer, I could never visit you. It would be socially impossible.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I couldn't bear it. It would have killed me never to come to Hartfield again.
Dear, sweet little friend,
said Emma.
Let me help you write your answer.
The letter was sent.
Poor Mr. Martin,
said Harriet sadly.
You will always be welcome here at Hartfield. And remember Mr. Elton. At this moment he is in London. Perhaps he is showing your portrait to his mother and sisters.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do you think so?
Next day, Mr. Knightley called on Emma. He was very angry when he found out that Harriet had refused Mr. Martin.
The girl is a fool. Emma, is this your work? Did you persuade her to refuse him?
How can she accept him? He is not her equal.
Not Harriet's equal? Harriet is pretty and kind, but that is all. Robert Martin is sensible, sincere, and is a natural gentleman.
Anyway,
said Emma,
Harriet has a different destiny.
Are you matchmaking?
asked Mr. Knightley.
Well, if Mr. Elton is a part of your plan, then you are making a great mistake.
He left angrily. Mr. Elton brought back the picture from London, and they hung it in the main room.
It is a beautiful painting,
he sighed. Harriet was busy writing out riddles in a book. It was a fashionable thing for young ladies to do, to copy clever pieces of literature.
Why don't you write a riddle for us, Mr. Elton?
Asked Emma.
I'm not clever enough,
He said, but next day he arrived with a piece of paper. He gave it to Emma. When he had gone, Emma and Harriet read it together.
In my first, rich kings live at ease.
That means court.
Thought Emma.
My second is the monarch of the seas.
That means ship.
Thought Emma.
But united, all man's freedom is flown, and woman, lovely woman, reigns alone.
That means courtship.
Thought Emma.
Your ready wit the word will soon supply. May its approval smile in that soft eye.
That is Harriet's soft eye.
Thought Emma.
I don't understand.
Said Harriet.
What does it mean? Monarch of the seas? Is that a mermaid or a shark?
Mermaids and sharks? Nonsense! My dear Harriet, the answer is courtship. It is written for you. I congratulate you with all my heart. Here is proof that Mr. Elton loves you.
Dear Miss Woodhouse,
Said Harriet.
oh, Mr. Elton is a true gentleman, like Mr. Knightley.
That evening, Mr. Elton called again.
Thank you for the riddle.
Said Emma.
I have written it in Miss Smith's book.
That is an honour, Miss Woodhouse.
Said Mr. Elton gallantly.
It is the proudest moment of my life.
Next day, Emma was walking in the village with Harriet.
One day, Harriet, you will live in the vicarage, and I shall come and visit you.
And I shall visit you, Miss Woodhouse, when you are married.
No, I shall never marry. I have never been in love because I have never met a superior man. I am content to live in my father's house. It is a perfect life.
They went to the cottage of a poor family of the village. Emma went inside to talk to the sick children and to offer advice and sympathy. Walking on, they met Mr. Elton in the lane. He walked with them until they reached the vicarage.
Harriet must go inside.
Thought Emma.
I have an idea.
She stopped and pretended to tie her bootlace. While no one was looking, she broke the lace and threw it away.
Oh,
She cried.
part of my lace is missing. Mr. Elton, may I stop at your house and ask your housekeeper for help?
Dear Miss Woodhouse, please come inside. Oh, and Miss Smith, too.
Inside the house, Emma asked the housekeeper to mend her boot, leaving Mr. Elton and Harriet alone in the next room.
Perhaps he will ask her to marry him.
But Emma was disappointed. He said nothing. Isabella, Mr. John Knightley, their 5 children and their nursemaids came to Hartfield for Christmas. One evening, they talked about the Westons.
But has Mr. Weston's son come to visit them since the wedding?
Asked John. When Mr. Weston's first wife had died, their son, Frank Churchill, had gone to live with his wealthy aunt and uncle in the north of England, in Yorkshire. He was now 23 years old, but his aunt, Mrs. Churchill, was a proud, stubborn old lady. She made it difficult for Frank to visit his father at Highbury.
No,
Answered Emma.
he has written a letter promising to visit, but he has not yet come here. All of Highbury wants to see him.
Later, Mr. Knightley joined them for dinner. Emma was holding Isabella's baby daughter in her arms. He came up to her and she passed the child to him.
At least we can agree about our baby niece.
She said.
We both think that she is charming.
If you judged adults as well as you judged children, we would always agree.
He smiled.
I hope that Mr. Martin is not too disappointed.
A man could not be more disappointed.
I am very sorry.
Said Emma sincerely.
But come, shake hands with me.
They were friends again. Later that evening, they decided that they would all visit Randall's on Christmas Eve. Mr. Elton and Harriet would be invited too. Unfortunately, Harriet developed a sore throat. Emma told Mr. Elton,
"She is too ill to come to the party."
Be careful, Miss Woodhouse. Do not catch the infection from her.
"But you must be careful too, Mr. Elton. Don't come out in the cold weather. Remember, you must preach on Christmas Day."
Thank you. The advice of such a beautiful lady is precious to me. But I am looking forward to the party.
How strange,
Emma thought.
The woman he loves is ill, but he still smiles.
Be careful, Emma,
said Mr. John Knightley.
I think Mr. Elton is in love with you. I have been watching him.
With me? What an idea! You are quite mistaken.
Part 3. The Great Mistake. It was Christmas Eve. The carriages were ready in the courtyard at Hartfield, and Emma travelled in the second one with Mr. John Knightley. It was already beginning to snow. At the vicarage, Mr. Elton joined them. He seemed extremely happy. She did not understand. His loved one was ill. They entered Randall's. Mr. Weston was talking about Mr. Frank Churchill. Emma found that the name had a strange effect on her feelings. She was inexplicably excited. Frank would visit Highbury in January. Emma had never met Frank Churchill, but she had frequently thought that, if she ever married, he was the most suitable person in age, character, and social position. Their families were connected. He seemed to belong to her.
"We are not sure that Frank will come,"
said Mrs. Weston later.
"His aunt may refuse to allow him. The Churchills think that the Westons are below them."
You told me that he was in Weymouth in the autumn. Then surely he can find time to visit his father,
said Emma.
"He is his aunt's favourite. She will find a way to keep him in Yorkshire."
Standing beside her, Mr. Elton began talking to Emma.
You must promise me, Miss Woodhouse, not to see Harriet again until she is well. You must not put yourself in danger of becoming ill yourself. Don't you agree with me, Mrs. Weston?
Emma gave him an angry look. He was talking as if he had the right of first interest in her. At that moment, Mr. John Knightley came into the room.
There is a snowstorm outside. The roads may be blocked. We may not be able to get back tonight. Oh, the poor horses! What shall we do, my dear Emma?
Cried Mr. Woodhouse.
My children are at Hartfield,
said Isabella. Mr. Knightley had kept calm. He went out to examine the road and returned.
There is no difficulty,
he reported.
There is very little snow on the ground, and the clouds are already clearing.
But Mr. Woodhouse was so worried that they decided to leave immediately. They all went out to the carriages. Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella got in the first carriage. In the confusion, Mr. John Knightley joined them, forgetting that he was travelling with Emma. She got in the second carriage and found Mr. Elton following her. The coachman shut the door. They were alone together. And Mr. Elton had been drinking Mr. Weston's red wine. As soon as the carriage passed through the gates, Mr. Elton seized her hand.
You know that I love you. I am ready to die for you. Please accept me as your husband.
I am very much astonished, Mr. Elton. You are in love with Miss Smith. How can you say these words to me?
Miss Smith? I have never been interested in Miss Smith. It is you I love, dear Miss Woodhouse. Say that you will marry me.
For the past month, you have been courting Miss Smith. You took her portrait to London. You wrote a riddle for her. You visited her at Hartfield constantly. This is very bad behaviour, Mr. Elton.
Good heavens!
Cried Mr. Elton.
I never ever thought of Miss Smith. She is a penniless orphan. Everything I have said and done has been for you. I am sure that you understood.
Emma was coldly silent. But Mr. Elton tried to seize her hand again.
Charming Miss Woodhouse, do not be shy. Confess that you return my affections.
No, sir,
cried Emma.
I have always thought that you loved my friend. I could never consider marrying you.
Mr. Elton was silent. He sat angrily in his corner of the carriage, while Emma sat angrily in hers. The carriage went slowly through the snow. The journey was like torture for them. Mr. Elton jumped out as soon as they arrived at the vicarage.
Good night,
said Emma.
Good night,
he replied, coldly and proudly. The carriage drove on to Hartfield. Emma was feeling very miserable.
How shall I tell Harriet? I have been only half a friend to her.
Isabella and John returned to London soon after Christmas. Mr. Elton wrote to Mr. Woodhouse,
I am going to Bath for a few weeks to spend some time with friends.
Harriet, of course, was heartbroken. There was more bad news. Frank Churchill wrote that he could not come to Highbury.
My aunt cannot spare me.
Mr. Knightley was furious.
He must be a very proud, selfish young man to treat his father in this way.
But he depends on the Churchills. You are independent. You cannot understand his situation. When he finally comes to Hartfield, I shall welcome him. We do not often see fine young men, well-bred and fashionable.
My dear Emma, he is a spoilt puppy.
Emma and Harriet went to visit Miss Bates. Miss Bates began talking at once and did not stop.
I have had a long letter from Jane, my niece.
Jane Fairfax was an orphan. Her father had been killed in the war overseas, and her mother had died soon afterwards. Fortunately, she had been brought up by her father's friend, Colonel Campbell, and his wife. She was a companion for their daughter, who had just got married to Mr. Dixon, a rich young man. The Campbells lived in Weymouth, but Mr. Dixon had taken his new bride to live in Ireland with him. As Jane had no wealth of her own, she now had to leave the Campbell family and find a job as a governess. But first, she would come to Highbury and stay with her aunt.
Jane will miss Mr. and Mrs. Dixon. Mr. Dixon once saved her from drowning, you know.
Emma's imagination began to work.
I wonder if Jane is in love with Mr. Dixon. Perhaps that is why she is coming here, to escape a broken heart.
Emma had not seen Jane Fairfax for 2 years.
You envy her,
Mr. Knightley once said.
She is a really talented young woman.
Yes, Jane could play the piano, sing, and draw better than Emma. But also she was cold and reserved. As soon as Jane arrived, Emma went to visit her. She liked her better. She was elegant, with more beauty in her face than Emma remembered. Her eyes were deep grey with dark eyelashes and eyebrows. Her skin was clear and delicate. She seemed ill.
Perhaps she is heartbroken for Mr. Dixon,
imagined Emma. Then Jane visited Hartfield with her aunt. Miss Bates talked without stopping about Jane's talents and her health. Then both Emma and Jane played the piano, but Jane was clearly more talented.
Did you meet Frank Churchill when you were in Weymouth?
Asked Emma.
Is he handsome?
Yes, I met him, but I hardly remember him.
She is so cold, so reserved,
thought Emma.
I don't like her after all. Harriet will continue to be my first friend.
Next day, Mr. Knightley called at Hartfield.
I was so pleased to see that you and Jane Fairfax were friends last night,
he said to Emma.
It was kind of you to let her play at the piano. She has no piano at Miss Bates's house.
At that moment, Miss Bates and Jane themselves entered. Miss Bates could not wait to give the latest news.
Mr. Elton is going to be married. He has met Miss Hawkins at Bath. She comes from a rich trading family. It is a very good match.
Poor Harriet,
thought Emma immediately.
Poor Mr. Elton. He is very young to get married,
said Mr. Woodhouse. Emma had to tell Harriet the news. Luckily, Harriet had just met Mr. Martin and his sister in the village shop. They had talked kindly to her. She did not care so much about Mr. Elton.
it was all my mistake,
thought Emma.
but Harriet is too good to be a farmer's wife. I must try to help her.
Part 4. A Trifling Young Fellow. Mr. Elton returned to Highbury with a self-satisfied smile. His fiancée, Miss Augusta Hawkins of Bath and Bristol, was rumoured to be charming, beautiful, and perhaps more importantly, in possession of £10,000 a year. He had caught both wealth and affection, all in a few weeks in Bath. Emma decided that it was best if Harriet visited the Martin family. It would help her forget. But the visit to Abbey Mill Farm only lasted 14 minutes. Emma did not want Harriet to fall in love again.
They have been very kind,
Harriet told her.
It is a pity they do not belong to a higher class,
thought Emma.
but I cannot allow Harriet to mix with them.
On the way home, she was pleased to see Mr. and Mrs. Weston.
Frank is coming tomorrow.
Said Mr. Weston excitedly.
He'll stay for a whole fortnight.
Next morning, Mr. Weston and his son visited Hartfield.
He is a very good-looking young man.
Thought Emma.
Tell me about life in Highbury, Miss Woodhouse.
Frank asked.
Do you ride? Are there pleasant walks? Are there balls?
Emma was aware that Mr. Weston was watching her and Frank Churchill together. She knew what he and Mrs. Weston hoped for, that Frank and Emma might fall in love and marry. Mr. Woodhouse, however, had no such idea.
Poor young man,
He said.
Did you have a hard journey? Will you have some gruel, sir? Some Hartfield gruel?
I must pay one other visit in Highbury.
Said Frank.
At Weymouth, I met a young lady from here called Miss Fairfax, I believe. It would be polite to call on her.
Next day, Emma went out with Mrs. Weston to show the village of Highbury to Frank. Seeing the Crown Inn, he immediately said,
We must organize a ball here.
Did you pay your visit yesterday?
She asked.
Yes, indeed. The aunt talked and talked.
What did you think of Miss Fairfax?
She looked very pale, almost ill, but very elegant.
Did you see her often at Weymouth?
Frank had seen the village shop.
Forgive me, but I must go in and buy some gloves. Then I shall be a true citizen of Highbury.
Inside the shop, he chose the most fashionable and expensive pair of gloves.
Yes, I met Miss Fairfax frequently, with the family of Colonel Campbell. The Campbells are very warm-hearted people.
He paused.
By the way, Miss Woodhouse, have you heard her play the piano?
Yes, she plays charmingly.
Yes. Mr. Dixon, who is an expert in music, always asked her to play.
Emma smiled. Her imagination had been correct. Jane Fairfax and Mr. Dixon were in love.
Is Mr. Dixon very musical, then? Miss Fairfax is so reserved that she told us nothing about him.
Yes, he loves music. He said no one played as well as Miss Fairfax.
If I had been Miss Campbell,
Said Emma.
I would have been jealous. But Miss Fairfax herself must have been embarrassed by the flattery.
I do not know what her feelings were.
Of course not. Miss Fairfax is so reserved that her feelings are known only to herself.
True. It is impossible to love a reserved person.
Agreed Frank Churchill. The next day, Frank Churchill disappeared from Highbury. He had gone to London to have a haircut. It seemed frivolous to leave his father just to have a fashionable hairstyle. But in all other ways, He was an excellent young man. He was open, cheerful, lively, attentive, warm-hearted. Emma was not in love, but she would allow others to think that she was. When Mr. Knightley heard about the haircut in London, his face grew dark.
The young puppy. He is just the trifling, silly young fellow I took him for.
Emma, however, had her own problems. The Coles had invited her to a party. The Coles were a family from a low social class, but their business had done well, so that now they were rich. Emma, the mistress of Hartfield, was far too snobbish to accept their invitation. But they had invited all her friends. Frank Churchill would be there, but not Emma. Perhaps there would be dancing.
What do you think, Mrs. Weston?
She asked.
I cannot accept, can I?
It would be an honour for them if Miss Woodhouse came to their house. Accept their invitation, Emma.
This was really the advice that Emma wanted to hear.
Very well. I shall accept. Will there be dancing, do you think?
In the evening, the carriage took her to the house of the Coles. Mr. Knightley arrived at the same time in his own carriage, instead of walking as he usually did.
I am pleased to see you travelling like a gentleman,
She told him.
Nonsensical girl.
He replied affectionately. Frank Churchill seemed to want to spend all his time with her at the party. But there was interesting news.
A piano has arrived at the home of Miss Bates,
Said Mrs. Cole.
It is a very handsome instrument. It is a gift for Miss Fairfax, but no one knows who has sent it.
Of course it is from Colonel Campbell.
Yes, it must be, but he has not mentioned it in his letters to Jane. It is a great mystery.
Emma smiled secretively at Frank Churchill.
Do you think it is possible that Mr. Dixon has sent the piano? I believe that Mr. Dixon and Miss Fairfax were a little in love with each other. Did you know that he saved her from drowning?
Yes, I was there. Miss Fairfax nearly fell into the water. Mr. Dixon caught her. It all happened in a moment.
A moment is enough to fall in love. I am sure that the piano is a gift from Mr. Dixon.
She said.
Yes,
Agreed Frank.
you must be right.
Soon, Harriet and Jane arrived. Emma saw that Frank was staring intently at Jane Fairfax on the other side of the room.
What is the matter?
She asked. He woke as if from a dream.
Excuse me, I am very rude. I was looking at Miss Fairfax's hairstyle. It is very strange. I shall go and ask her about it.
While Frank went to speak to Jane, Mrs. Weston sat with Emma.
Do you know that Mr. Knightley has lent his carriage to Miss Bates and Jane so that they did not have to walk?
Indeed.
Said Emma.
Mr. Knightley is always very kind and thoughtful.
I think it is more than kindness.
Whispered Mrs. Weston.
I think he is in love with Jane Fairfax.
Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax?
Exclaimed Emma.
No, Mr. Knightley must not marry. Isabella's children would not inherit Donwell Abbey. Poor little Henry, and Jane Fairfax of all women.
Jane has always been his favourite, as you know.
Please, Mrs. Weston, do not become a matchmaker. Jane Fairfax cannot be mistress of Donwell Abbey.
Perhaps he has sent her the piano.
Mr. Knightley does nothing mysteriously. I do not believe that he has any idea of marrying Jane Fairfax.
Well, Frank wants you to sing with him. Go to him, Emma.
After Emma and Frank had sung at the piano, Frank sang with Jane Fairfax. She played with great talent. Mr. Knightley sat watching them with Emma.
The piano is a very kind gift from the Campbells,
She said, testing him.
Yes, but they should have warned her that it was coming. Surprises are foolish things.
He paused, looking angrily towards the piano.
Frank Churchill is asking her to sing another song. She is already tired. He only thinks about his own pleasure. He is a trifling, silly young fellow.
He spoke to Miss Bates, and she rescued Jane. Dancing followed. Emma and Frank Churchill led the dance. She looked to see if Mr. Knightley danced with Jane, but he was talking to Mrs. Cole.
You dance beautifully, Miss Woodhouse,
said Frank Churchill, as he helped her into her carriage at the end of the party. Part 6. Harriet is rescued twice. Everybody in Highbury invited the newly married couple to dinner.
We are quite the fashion,
said Mrs. Elton proudly.
I must invite them also,
thought Emma,
or people will accuse me of being jealous.
I saw you walking in the rain this morning, Miss Fairfax,
said John Knightley at the dinner. He was visiting from London.
I hope you did not have to go far.
I went only to the post office. I always fetch the letters when I am here. A walk before breakfast does me good.
Mr. Woodhouse had been listening.
Young ladies must take care of themselves in bad weather. They are delicate plants. Did you change your stockings, my dear?
Mrs. Elton now added her opinion.
You must not go for your letters in the rain, Miss Fairfax. I shall speak to Mr. E. One of our servants will fetch them for you.
Excuse me,
said Jane seriously,
but I cannot consent. It is a pleasure for me to go to the post office. That is the end of the matter.
Emma was wondering.
Do Jane Fairfax's letters come from Ireland? From Mr. Dixon?
You must soon find a job as a governess, Jane,
said Mrs. Elton.
I am sure my sister at Maple Grove can find you a suitable position with an excellent family.
I shall see the Campbells in London in the summer. I do not wish to find a job until then.
But, my dear child, it is already April. I shall ask my sister to start looking.
No,
repeated Jane.
I wish to stay as I am for 3 or 4 months.
Mr. Weston arrived late at the party with a letter in his hands.
Read it,
he said.
Only a few lines. Read it to Emma.
The letter was from Frank Churchill. His aunt had recovered and decided to come to London. Frank would be able to visit Highbury frequently during the summer. Emma felt strangely excited, but also worried.
I hope I shall soon have the pleasure of introducing my son to you,
Mr. Weston said to Mrs. Elton.
I and my caro sposo will look forward to meeting him. He lives with a great family, I believe. Does Mrs. Churchill have a barouche landau?
Mrs. Churchill is an arrogant, insolent woman. I should not speak badly of her, but she keeps Frank away from me. She was a nobody until she married Mr. Churchill.
A nobody? They often make the most noise,
said Mrs. Elton. When Frank Churchill visited Highbury again, he seemed happy but less in love with Emma. One thing was sure. The ball at the Crown Inn would take place after all. The day of the ball arrived. Frank was nervous. He seemed to be waiting for somebody to arrive. Soon, the Eltons came.
My caro sposo and I will send our carriage for Miss Bates and Jane,
said Mrs. Elton loudly. As soon as the carriage arrived, Frank went out with umbrellas to protect them from the rain.
He is a very fine young man, Mr. Weston,
said Mrs. Elton. Miss Bates entered, talking continuously.
No rain at all, and Jane says, well, this is brilliant, so well lighted. Oh, Mr. Weston! Oh, Mr. Elton!
She did not stop talking for the next 10 minutes. The dancing was ready to begin.
I am sorry, Emma,
said Mrs. Weston,
but Mrs. Elton must lead the dance. We must honour the new wife.
Emma was disappointed. but accepted the situation calmly. She and Frank Churchill stood second to Mrs. Elton and Mr. Weston. It was almost enough to make her think of marrying. However, she greatly enjoyed the evening. She felt sad, though, that Mr. Knightley was not dancing. He stood with the older men, often watching Emma as she danced with Frank Churchill. She noticed how he stood out from all the other men with his tall figure, broad shoulders, and gentlemanly manners. The partners changed, then changed again. Emma noticed that Harriet had no partner. Mr. Elton was the only gentleman free, but although he deliberately passed near Harriet, he did not ask her to dance.
Do you not dance, Mr. Elton?
Mrs. Weston asked him.
Most readily with you, madam,
He said gallantly.
I am no dancer. You must get a better partner.
I will dance with Mrs. Gilbert.
No, I would like to see Miss Smith dancing.
Mr. Elton smiled cruelly.
Miss Smith, you must excuse me. I am an old married man. My dancing days are over.
He then joined Mr. Knightley's group, exchanging another cruel smile with his wife. Poor Harriet sat alone. Then Emma saw a wonderful thing. Mr. Knightley led Harriet to the dance. Emma had never felt more surprised or more delighted. He was a very good dancer, and Harriet herself was full of lovely smiles. Mr. Elton left the room.
Knightley has taken pity on poor Miss Smith,
Said Mrs. Elton loudly.
It is very good-natured of him.
Emma searched for Mr. Knightley with her eyes. He came to her side, and she thanked him.
Mr. Elton was unpardonably rude, and Mrs. Elton's looks were also inexcusable.
He said.
They aimed at wounding more than Harriet. Emma, why are they your enemies?
She did not reply.
You did want him to marry Harriet. Confess it, Emma.
I did,
Replied Emma.
and they cannot forgive me. I admit that I was completely mistaken in Mr. Elton. There is a littleness about him which you discovered and I did not.
You would have chosen for him better than he chose himself. Harriet is a modest, natural girl that any man of sense and taste would prefer to Mrs. Elton.
Emma was very pleased.
Who are you going to dance with?
Asked Mr. Knightley. Emma hesitated a moment and then replied,
With you, if you will ask me.
Will you?
He said, offering his hand.
Of course. You have shown me you can dance, and we are not so much brother and sister that it is improper.
Brother and sister? Certainly not.
Next day, Emma sat remembering the ball and Mr. Knightley's kindness to her friend.
Perhaps my life is really perfect.
She thought. Just then, the great gates of Hartfield swung open. 2 people entered. Frank Churchill with Harriet, white and frightened, leaning on his arm. As soon as they were in the hall, Harriet fainted. Recovering, she told Emma her story. She and another girl had gone for a walk in the country along the London road. Some distance beyond Highbury, as the road turned suddenly, covered by trees on either side, they saw a group of gypsies ahead of them at the edge of the forest. A gypsy child came towards them to beg. Harriet's friend was frightened. She screamed, climbed up a steep bank, and ran back towards the village. But poor Harriet could not follow. Her legs were tired after dancing. The gypsy children, led by a strong woman and a great boy, surrounded her. More and more frightened, she took out her purse and gave them a shilling. She begged them to let her go and was slowly moving away, But her terror and her purse had excited them, and the whole gang followed her, demanding more. Fortunately, Frank Churchill was walking along the same road.
It was lucky,
He explained.
I went to the house of Miss Bates to return some borrowed scissors before I left. I was walking along the road to find my servant and the horses.
As soon as they saw him, the gypsies ran away. Frank immediately brought Harriet to Hartfield. That was the whole story. Emma's imagination was on fire. A fine young man and a lovely young woman had shared a great adventure. Of course, they must fall in love as a result. It was certain. Next day, Harriet burnt everything that she had kept in memory of her love for Mr. Elton. A pencil he had used, a plaster he had given her.
My heart is given to a man who is very superior to Mr. Elton,
she told Emma seriously. Emma smiled. She was sure that Harriet was referring to Frank Churchill.
I am not surprised. He rendered you a great service.
Yes, he rescued my heart,
sighed Harriet. That evening, everyone was together at Hartfield. Mr. Knightley was worried. A strange thing had happened. Frank Churchill had asked Mrs. Weston if Mr. Perry, the village chemist, had bought a carriage yet.
You wrote to me in a letter 3 months ago that he planned to do so.
Impossible. I have never heard of any such plan.
I must have dreamed it,
said Frank.
It was a strange dream,
interrupted Miss Bates.
Mr. Perry told me about 3 months ago that he wanted to buy a carriage, but I told nobody except Jane. Then he changed his mind. Your dream was true, Mr. Churchill.
Mr. Knightley saw that Frank was confused and that Jane hid her face. After tea, Emma and her visitors played a game. Each person was given some letters which they had to rearrange into a word. During the game, Frank Churchill handed some letters to Jane Fairfax. She smiled and pushed the letters away. At once, Harriet innocently took them and, sitting next to Mr. Knightley, turned to him for help. The word was blunder. Mr. Knightley continued to watch. Frank and Emma were laughing together. Then Frank took more letters to Jane. X, D, N, O, I. The word was Dixon. Jane looked up, blushed deeply, and angrily mixed the letters again. Then she turned to her aunt and said that she wished to go home.
Emma,
said Mr. Knightley later,
have you ever thought that there is an attachment between Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax?
Never, never. What ridiculous ideas you have.
Part 7. The Disaster at Box Hill. Emma had arranged with Mr. Weston to visit Box Hill, a well-known beauty spot which she had never seen. Mr. Weston invited Mrs. Elton too. But when one of the horses became lame, the excursion was delayed.
You had better come to Donwell instead,
said Mr. Knightley.
Come and eat my strawberries.
Mrs. Elton was delighted.
Name the day, Knightley. I shall choose the guests for you.
There is only one married woman in the world who I can ever allow to invite guests to Donwell.
Mrs. Weston, I suppose,
said Mrs. Elton, disappointed.
No, Mrs. Knightley. And until she exists, I will invite the guests myself.
Ha ha! You are a strange man, Knightley. Well, as it is an open-air party, perhaps I shall come on a donkey. We will gather the strawberries ourselves and sit under the trees to eat them.
Not at all. We shall eat in the dining room. Mr. Woodhouse would never sit under a tree.
Under a bright sun on Midsummer's Day, everyone met at Donwell. Emma loved the Abbey. Mrs. Elton led the way to the strawberry fields. She looked ridiculous in a large bonnet and carrying a huge basket.
My friend, Mrs. Bragg, who lives near Maple Grove, needs a governess,
she told Jane Fairfax.
I have told her all about you. You must accept immediately.
Let's look at the gardens,
said Jane, wanting to escape. They looked out over the sweet view of hills, woods, meadows, and river. Emma thought that it was the perfect English countryside. Mr. Knightley and Harriet were walking together, leading the way. Emma met Jane Fairfax near the house.
Please, Miss Woodhouse, tell the others that I am going home. I must go.
Certainly, but you are not going to walk alone.
Yes, I walk fast. I shall be at home in 20 minutes.
Let me order a carriage. You are tired.
Thank you, but no. Miss Woodhouse, we all know that sometimes we are wearied in spirit. The greatest kindness will be to leave me alone.
Emma understood. She suddenly felt deep sympathy for Jane, who, with no fortune or rich family, was the victim of Mrs. Elton. 15 minutes later, Frank Churchill arrived.
It is very hot outside. I am late. I shall soon have to go again. I met Miss Fairfax on the way. Walking. Madness in this hot weather. Madness.
Emma realized that he was in a bad mood because of the weather.
As soon as my aunt is well, I shall go abroad, to Switzerland. I want a change. I am serious, Miss Woodhouse. I am sick of England. I would leave tomorrow if I could.
We are going to Box Hill tomorrow. Will you join us? It is not Switzerland, but it will be a small change for you.
Miss Woodhouse, you are my queen. I shall come to Box Hill.
The next day was fine. Everyone expected a pleasant excursion. When they arrived, they all agreed that the view was splendid. Frank Churchill paid great attention to Emma, and she, feeling flattered, responded. Soon it was obvious to everyone that Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Emma Woodhouse were flirting with each other. But he was not winning back Emma's heart.
Yesterday I was in a bad mood because I was hot. Today I am cool because I am with you. You are my queen.
Since yesterday?
Since I first saw you in February.
You are very gallant, but we are the only people speaking. It is hard work talking nonsense for the enjoyment of 7 silent people.
I say nothing that I am ashamed of. I first saw you in February. Let everybody on the hill hear me.
He spoke even more loudly.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Woodhouse orders me to say that she wishes to know what you are thinking about.
A few people laughed. Mrs. Elton was angry because Emma was the queen of the day. Mr. Knightley answered very clearly.
Is Miss Woodhouse sure that she wants to know our thoughts?
Frank spoke again.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Woodhouse orders me to say that each of you must say 1 very clever thing, or 2 moderately clever things, or 3 very stupid things.
Oh!
Exclaimed Miss Bates.
3 very stupid things. That will just suit me. I shall be sure to say 3 very stupid things as soon as I open my mouth.
Emma could not resist.
Ah, madam, that may be difficult for you. You will be limited in number, only 3 at a time.
There was a sudden silence. For a moment, Miss Bates did not understand the insult. Then she blushed. Hurt, not angry.
Well,
she said to Mr. Knightley,
I will try to keep quiet. I must be very disagreeable, or she would not have said such a thing to an old friend. I have nothing clever to say,
said Mrs. Elton.
Yes, please excuse me also,
said Mr. Elton.
I am an old married man. I have nothing to say that can amuse Miss Woodhouse. Let's go for a walk, Augusta.
Yes, Mr. E.
They are a happy couple.
Frank Churchill said sarcastically.
They are exactly right for each other. They only knew each other for a few weeks in Bath before they got married. But it is very unusual that you can form a real relationship in a public place like Bath or Weymouth. Many men have got married after knowing somebody for a few weeks, and then regretted it for the rest of their lives.
Jane Fairfax spoke.
I agree that men and women sometimes make mistakes about each other, but only weak, dependent characters will not recover from an unlucky acquaintance of that kind.
Frank Churchill turned to Emma.
Well, I hope that somebody will choose my wife for me. Will you, Miss Woodhouse? I am sure I should like your choice. Find somebody for me. And make her like yourself. Adopt her. Educate her.
Very well. You will have a charming wife.
She must be very lively, like you, and have hazel eyes, like yours. I shall go abroad for a couple of years, and when I return, I shall come to you for a wife. Remember?
Emma was thinking of Harriet. Apart from the colour of her eyes, she was the perfect wife for Frank.
Now, Aunt,
said Jane Fairfax, rising quickly.
Let us join Mrs. Elton.
She seemed upset. Then the carriages arrived. The excursion to Box Hill was finished. Mr. Knightley stood by her and spoke quietly.
Emma, I must speak to you as an old friend. You have behaved very wrongly. How could you be so unkind to Miss Bates?
Emma laughed.
I am sure she did not understand me.
I know that she did. She has talked to me since then. She is a very unlucky woman, Emma. She is poor, with nothing to look forward to except a lonely old age. You have acted thoughtlessly. Please forgive me, Emma, for speaking so directly.
They reached the carriage. Before she had time to say anything, she was driven away with Harriet. She felt terribly upset. To her surprise, tears began to run down her cheeks, and she did nothing to stop them. That evening, Emma played cards with her father, but she was thinking of Mr. Knightley's words. He had left thinking that she was hard-hearted and proud before she had time to excuse herself. Next morning, she went to visit Miss Bates to apologize. When she arrived, Jane went quickly into her bedroom. Emma saw her face briefly. She looked very sad and ill.
She has a dreadful headache, poor Jane,
said Miss Bates.
She has been writing to Colonel Campbell and Mrs. Dixon with tears in her eyes. Of course she is very lucky. Mrs. Elton has found her a job as a governess with a very good family near Maple Grove. All yesterday Jane refused to go, but when she came back from Box Hill, Jane said yes.
It must be sad for her to leave her friends.
She decided everything so very quickly. Mr. and Mrs. Elton were here. We heard that Mr. Churchill had gone back to London, and then after tea Jane decided. She cannot take the piano with her, of course. Colonel Campbell will decide what to do.
When she returned to Hartfield, Emma found Mr. Knightley and Harriet there with her father. Mr. Knightley immediately got up, looking more serious than usual.
I came to say goodbye. I'm going to London for a few days to visit John and Isabella.
But isn't this a sudden plan?
They stood talking briefly. Emma was sure that he had not forgiven her. Mr. Woodhouse interrupted.
Well, my dear, did you reach Miss Bates's house safely? Dear Emma has been to call on Mrs. and Miss Bates, Mr. Knightley. She is always so kind to them.
Emma blushed. With a smile and a shake of her head, she looked almost shyly at Mr. Knightley. His eyes seemed to receive the truth from hers. He said nothing, but he forgave her. As he left, he took her hand. He pressed it and seemed about to carry it to his lips. Then, for some reason, he let it go. She felt, however, that it had been a gesture of perfect friendship. Then he left for London. Next day there was astonishing news. Mrs. Churchill, Frank's tyrannical aunt, had died. Emma realized that Frank would now be free to marry whoever he wished. Lucky Harriet. Emma remembered Jane Fairfax's sad face and wrote to her, inviting her to Hartfield. But Jane did not accept. She was too ill. However, later she was seen walking alone in the fields near Highbury. It was clear that she wanted to accept no kindness from Miss Woodhouse. Suddenly, Mr. Weston arrived at Hartfield.
Emma, you must come to Randalls. Mrs. Weston must see you. There is terrible news.
Part 8. The Autumn Marriages.
What is wrong?
Asked Emma as they walked quickly to Randalls.
Is Mrs. Weston ill?
No, nothing of the kind. She will tell you herself. I promised I would let her break it to you.
Good God!
Said Emma, suddenly terrified.
Is it my sister and her family? Are they ill?
No, it has nothing to do with them. Be patient.
They arrived at Randalls.
Mrs. Weston, my dear, I have brought her. I shall leave you together. She has not the least idea.
My dear friend,
said Emma.
Tell me quickly, what is the trouble?
Have you no idea?
None.
Well, Frank visited us this morning. He came to tell his father that...
Yes?
That he has been secretly engaged to Jane Fairfax for the last 9 months.
Jane Fairfax? Good God! You are not serious.
Yes. They fell in love at Weymouth and have kept it a secret from everybody. Now that Mrs. Churchill is dead, they can tell the world.
Poor Harriet,
thought Emma.
He has hurt me and hurt his father. Why did he keep it a secret from us? But most of all, we are afraid that he has behaved very badly towards you.
I understand. But dear Mrs. Weston,
said Emma sincerely,
I have really cared nothing about him these last 3 months. That is the simple truth.
Mrs. Weston kissed her with tears of joy.
It was our dearest wish for you and Frank to be married, but I am so glad that you have not been in love yourself.
I have escaped, but that does not excuse him. He tried to please me, to make me fall in love with him. He was deceiving me and hurting Jane.
Yes, he knows that he has behaved improperly. He quarrelled with Jane and he reacted stupidly at Box Hill.
Oh, Mrs. Weston, he did not behave like a man of honour. He used tricks instead of depending on the truth.
But he has many good qualities, my dear. They have both suffered a great deal by keeping their relationship secret. Now Mr. Churchill, his uncle, will permit the marriage.
Mr. Weston returned. Emma laughed.
I congratulate you, Mr. Weston, with all my heart, on having one of the most lovely and talented young women in England as your future daughter-in-law.
When Emma returned to Hartfield, she saw Harriet.
Isn't the news strange?
Said Harriet.
Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax.
Emma was surprised. She did not seem upset.
I am very glad for Jane,
said Emma.
But I am sorry that I did not realise the truth and warn you.
Warn me? Do you think that I care about Frank Churchill? I am in love with a far superior gentleman.
Who do you mean, Harriet?
Mr. Knightley, of course.
But Frank Churchill rescued you from the gypsies.
And Mr. Knightley rescued me from the Eltons by dancing with me at the ball. That was a noble, kind, generous action. He is the best gentleman on the earth.
Good God!
Cried Emma.
I suppose, Miss Woodhouse, that you think that Mr. Knightley is too far above me. But if I am fortunate, if he returns my love, I hope you will not put difficulties in the way.
Do you think that Mr. Knightley is in love with you?
Yes,
replied Harriet.
I have seen signs.
Emma dropped her eyes and sat silently for a few minutes. She looked into her own heart. She made rapid progress, arriving suddenly at the whole truth. It darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself. Harriet talked about Mr. Knightley. They had danced at the ball, walked together at the strawberry party, sat next to each other at Hartfield. Emma remembered his words at the ball.
She is a natural, modest girl that any man...
At Donwell, he asked me if I was in love with anyone.
Perhaps he was asking for his friend, Robert Martin.
No,
said Harriet firmly.
he did not mention Mr. Martin. I care nothing for Mr. Martin. Dear Miss Woodhouse, tell me, do you think he loves me?
He is the best person in the world.
Said Emma.
That is all I can say.
Emma was completely confused. She knew that she had been blind to the feelings of others and to her own heart. When had Mr. Knightley become so dear to her? She compared Frank Churchill and Mr. Knightley. She had always thought Mr. Knightley superior. She had never really cared for Frank Churchill. She had behaved very badly. She had encouraged Harriet to fall in love with the wrong men. She had believed herself in the secret of everyone's feelings. She had tried to arrange other people's lives. And she herself had made Harriet vain and independent enough to dream of being the mistress of Donwell Abbey. Emma had never known before how much her happiness depended on being first with Mr. Knightley, first in interest and affection. She remembered how often they had quarrelled, but still he had loved her and watched over her. In spite of her faults, she knew that she was dear to him. But he had been very angry with her at Box Hill. The weather was dull and wet, and Mr. Woodhouse was unhappy. She had to amuse him constantly. But in the afternoon the rain cleared and there was calm sunlight. She went into the garden and walked around it once or twice. Then she saw Mr. Knightley. He had returned from London. He looked worried. Had he told his brother that he wanted to marry Harriet? Did Mr. Knightley now want to talk to Emma about his love for Harriet?
I have some news which will surprise you,
she said.
If it is about Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, then I have already heard,
he replied.
You were probably not surprised. You tried to tell me that they had an understanding, but I was blind.
She sighed heavily. He took her arm in his and pressed her hand against his chest.
Time, my dearest Emma, will heal the wound. The abominable scoundrel! He doesn't deserve her.
Emma realized what he thought.
You are very kind, but you are mistaken. I was blind, and I did some silly things, but I am glad that he and Jane are together. I never loved him.
Emma!
He cried, looking into her eyes.
I may have given the wrong impression, but I have never been attached to Frank Churchill. I enjoyed flirting with him. Now I understand that he was hiding his true feelings behind his attentions to me, but I was always safe from him.
Well,
said Mr. Knightley,
he is a fortunate man. He is going to marry one of the best of women. I envy him.
Is he going to speak about Harriet?
Thought Emma.
Emma, I want to tell you why I envy Frank Churchill. I cannot be wise, Emma. I must tell you what I feel, although I may wish it unsaid the next moment.
Then don't speak,
she said quickly. He must not tell her about Harriet. He was silent. Emma could see that he was suffering. As a friend, she ought to give him support in his love for Harriet.
I stopped you ungraciously just now, but if you wish to speak to me as a friend, I shall listen.
As a friend?
Repeated Mr. Knightley.
No, Emma. Not only as a friend. No, I have gone too far. Tell me then, have I no chance of ever succeeding?
He stopped. The expression of his eyes made her feel weak.
My dearest Emma, tell me at once. Say no if you must. You are silent. I ask no more.
Emma was afraid to believe the truth.
I cannot make speeches, Emma. If I loved you less, I might be able to speak about it more. All these years I have told you the truth about yourself, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. But you also have wonderful qualities.
Emma suddenly understood the whole truth. Harriet had been mistaken. Harriet was nothing to him. She herself, Emma Woodhouse, was everything. She told him what she had discovered about her own heart. Mr. Knightley was amazed. He had come unselfishly to comfort Emma for the loss of Frank Churchill. Within half an hour, he had passed from the greatest depression to perfect happiness. So Emma agreed to marry Mr. Knightley.
You must call me George,
he said.
But I have called you Mr. Knightley all my life. I shall call you George in the church. But while my father lives, I cannot leave Hartfield to live at Donwell Abbey. It must be a long engagement.
Then I shall come to live here at Hartfield.
Mrs. Weston showed them a long letter from Frank Churchill explaining his behaviour. He apologised to everyone and admitted his mistakes. He should not have flirted with Miss Woodhouse. He should not have embarrassed Jane by sending her the piano as a gift. But luckily, everything had ended happily.
I am the child of good fortune,
he wrote.
What will Harriet do now?
Wondered Emma.
Even Harriet cannot fall in love with more than 3 men in 1 year.
But Robert Martin still loved her. When he asked her again to marry him, she accepted gladly. All Highbury was talking about the engagement of Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Knightley.
Poor Knightley,
said Mrs. Elton. But everybody else was happy, except Mr. Woodhouse.
I am no friend to marriage,
he said.
Poor Miss Taylor, poor Isabella. Do not get married, my dear.
Luckily, somebody in the area stole some chickens and turkeys from the Westons during the night. Other houses were robbed.
If Mr. Knightley lives at Hartfield, Papa,
said Emma cleverly,
he can protect us. We can sleep well at night.
So even Mr. Woodhouse was glad that Emma was going to get married.